I was 17 minutes late for the most important meeting of my life, with my fiancé's father, a billionaire forged from steel. My reason? I had stopped in the pouring rain to bandage the bleeding hand of a homeless veteran and his shivering service dog. As I stepped into the glass-walled boardroom, they stared at me as if I were a complete failure. They had no idea I'd brought a witness, a recording, and the corporate bombshell that would bring them down. My name is Nova Vale, and at 8:13 a.m., in a city that worshipped the clock, I was already a sinner. The drizzle in Caldera wasn't the romantic kind you see in movies. It was a cold, persistent mist that clung to the steel and glass canyons of the financial district, turning the air gray and tasting of exhaust. It was the kind of rain that seeped into your bones and made you forget the sun existed. My own watch, a sleek, minimalist piece Mason had given me, confirmed the time, its slender hands a silent accusation. 8:13. 13 minutes past the time I should have been in a cab, and 17 minutes away from the moment my professional life would be put on trial. I knelt on the gritty sidewalk, the hem of my charcoal wool sheath dress soaking up the grime from the pavement. In my hands, I held a roll of sterile gauze from the emergency kit I kept in my briefcase, carefully wrapping it around the gnarled, bloodied knuckles of a man who probably hadn't had a warm meal in days. Beside him, a German shepherd with intelligent, weary eyes sat perfectly still, its body a taut line of protective loyalty. A faded patch on its vest read, "Echo." The dog watched my every move, a low tremor running through its powerful frame, not from aggression, but from the cold. I finished tying off the bandage and gave the old man's arm a gentle squeeze. He flinched, then nodded, his gaze distant. The city's relentless river of bespoke suits and designer heels flowed around us, an island of inconvenience in their morning commute. No one else stopped. No one else even looked. To them, we were invisible. I am 31 years old, and my official title is Lead Strategist at Huxley & Frey, a consulting firm with a reputation for being as sharp and unforgiving as the buildings we worked in. We were the people corporations called when they needed to make brutal decisions look like brilliant strategy. For the last 6 months, my entire existence had been consumed by Project Oriole, a massive ethics and data compliance overhaul for Elliston Meridian, the corporate behemoth we were set to merge with. And today, at 8:30 a.m., I was scheduled to present the final framework to its founder and CEO, the man who was essentially the king of this concrete kingdom, Grant Elliston. He was also, inconveniently, my fiancé's father. My fingers, numb with cold, fumbled for my phone. I kept one hand on Echo's head, stroking his damp fur. He leaned into my touch, a silent communion of trust. I dialed 911, my voice low and steady. Yes, I'm on the corner of Argent and 4th. I'm with an elderly male, appears to be a veteran, who has a minor laceration on his right hand. It's been cleaned and bandaged, but he's disoriented and exposed to the elements. I think he could use a wellness check and transport to a shelter. I gave the dispatcher a brief description, making sure to mention the service animal. He needs to stay with his dog, I insisted, my voice firm. After ending the call, I quickly opened a secure note-taking app on my phone, the one I used for witness interviews and sensitive data. I typed in the time, location, and a brief summary of the injury. Just a few lines, a small digital breadcrumb to ensure this man didn't just disappear back into the cracks of the city once I was gone. A way to follow up. Just as I saved the note, the phone vibrated with the brutal finality of an executioner's signal. A text message. The screen lit up with a name that made my stomach clench. Mason. The message contained only 2 words and a punctuation mark. 8:30 sharp. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Where are you?" Just a command. A reminder of the standard. It was so perfectly Mason. So perfectly Elliston. Efficiency over empathy. Punctuality over people. I looked from the cold, impersonal text to the old man's tired face, then to the unwavering loyalty in Echo's eyes. For a split second, I saw my entire future laid out before me. A series of glass-walled rooms, sterile conversations, and the constant, gnawing pressure to choose the Elliston way, to choose sharp. "They're sending someone for you," I said softly to the man. "They'll help you get warm and get that hand properly looked at," he grunted, a sound that could have been thanks or dismissal. It didn't matter. I gave Echo one last scratch behind the ears and stood up, my knees protesting. The dampness from my dress had seeped through to my skin. A chilling premonition. I didn't run, but every step I took towards the Elliston Meridian Tower was hurried. A frantic retreat from the humanity I'd just engaged in, and a desperate rush towards the judgment that awaited me. The lobby of the Elliston building was a cathedral of corporate power, soaring ceilings, acres of polished black marble, and a digital waterfall cascading down one entire wall, displaying stock tickers and market data in cool blue light. It was designed to make you feel small, insignificant. Today, it was working. The receptionist, a young woman named Chloe with an immaculately sculpted bun and a perpetually neutral expression, looked up as I hurried in. Her neutrality fractured for a fraction of a second. Her eyes swept over me, taking in my damp, slightly disheveled hair, the dark watermark on my expensive dress, the faint smudge of street grime on my hand that I hadn't had time to wash. Her head tilted, a micro-expression of something between pity and condescension. It was the look you give a colleague who has made a fatal, career-ending mistake. She didn't need to say a word. I was already being triaged as a failure. "They're in the Meridian boardroom. Ms. Vale," she said, her voice a little too gentle. "Floor 48. The elevator was a glass box rocketing up the side of the building, offering a panoramic, godlike view of the city, of Caldera. I could see the corner of Argent and 4th far below. A tiny intersection where a man and his dog were waiting for help. From this height, they were completely invisible. Up here, in this sterile cage of steel and glass. Problems like that didn't exist. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, a stranger with wild hair and panicked eyes. I tried to smooth my dress, to tuck the errant strands of hair back into place, but it was useless. I looked like what I was, someone who had prioritized a crisis on the street over a meeting in the sky, and in this world, that was an unforgivable sin. The elevator doors opened with a soft, deferential chime onto a silent, carpeted hallway. The air was different here, thinner, colder, smelling of expensive leather and ambition. The door to the Meridian boardroom was a massive slab of dark mahogany, closed and foreboding. I took one deep breath, squared my shoulders, and pushed it open. Silence. The room was a fishbowl, with one entire wall made of floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the sprawling city. Seated around a colossal black granite table were the three most important people in my professional life. Grant Elliston sat at the head, a titan in a perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair immaculate. He didn't look at me. His gaze went directly to the solid gold Rolex on his wrist, a deliberate, theatrical gesture of impatience. He held the pose for a beat too long, letting the indictment hang in the air. To his right sat my fiancé, Mason. His handsome face, usually so open and reassuring to me, was a tight, controlled mask. His lips were pressed into a thin, bloodless line. He wouldn't meet my eyes, staring instead at a blank space on the granite table as if it held the secrets to the universe. His disappointment was a physical force in the room, a wave of cold air washing over me. Across from him, Kira Holt, Elliston Meridian's notoriously ruthless CFO, let out a long, audible sigh. It was a masterpiece of passive aggression, a sound that conveyed boredom, frustration, and a profound sense of being inconvenienced by my very existence. She tapped a perfectly manicured finger on her tablet, the rhythmic click-click-click echoing in the dead silence. Finally, Grant Elliston lifted his eyes from his watch and pinned me with a gaze as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the room like a surgeon's scalpel. "Professionalism is punctual, Ms. Vale." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Ms. Vale, not Nova. The formality was another twist of the knife. I felt Mason flinch beside him. I saw the ghost of a smirk on Kira's lips. An assistant in the corner, previously unnoticed, began typing furiously, her keystrokes a quiet, damning record of my failure. I walked toward the empty chair reserved for me, my heels sinking into the plush carpet. I didn't apologize. I didn't make excuses about traffic or a stalled train. They wouldn't have cared, and it would have been a lie. I placed my briefcase beside my chair and looked directly at Grant Elliston, my voice even, my gaze unwavering. "I agree, Mr. Elliston," I said, the words clear and precise in the suffocating silence. I was choosing to be human first. The air in the room changed. It solidified, becoming thick and heavy. Grant's eyes narrowed. Kira's finger stopped tapping, and I saw it, out of the corner of my eye. The small, almost imperceptible shake of Mason's head. It wasn't a gesture of support. It was a signal of surrender. You've lost. You've said the wrong thing. You've failed the test. The silent sentence had been passed. The jury of 3 had reached their decision. Guilty. Guilty of prioritizing a bleeding stranger over a billion-dollar merger. Guilty of being human in a room that demanded gods. I sat down, pulling my chair up to the granite table. The cold stone felt like a tomb slab against my fingertips. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than the damp dress, that this was no longer about a late arrival. Those 17 minutes were not just a mark against my record. They were a gift to my opponents. They were the perfect, unimpeachable excuse they would use tonight at the H&F partnership dinner to dismantle my career, to kill my promotion, and to sideline the very project I had just saved from its own moral bankruptcy. They thought my tardiness was a sign of weakness, of being unfocused. They had no idea it was the source of my strength. They saw a failure. They didn't see the witness I now had. They didn't see the evidence that was burning a hole in my mind. I opened my laptop, the quiet click of the latch the only sound, and prepared for battle. They had just drawn the line, and I had just decided which side I was on. As I sat at that granite slab of a table, the silence stretching into an eternity, my mind raced backward. It wasn't just the last 17 minutes that had led me here. It was the last 6 months, a slow, methodical march toward a cliff I hadn't seen until I was standing at the edge. At Huxley and Frey. I was the architect of Project Oriole. It was more than a project. It was supposed to be our masterpiece, a landmark framework for ethical data implementation and labor compliance that would become the new industry standard. We were building it for Elliston Meridian, a company that had grown so fast and so vast it had outrun its own conscience. Oriole was meant to be its new conscience, coded in policy and procedure. It covered everything from algorithmic bias in hiring to supply chain data transparency. But the section I'd fought for the hardest was Section 7, Human Capital Safeguards. It was a dense, ironclad chapter on protecting the hourly and seasonal workers who were the invisible engine of Elliston's global machine. This project was my shot. The kind of career-defining work that gets you a corner office and a name whispered with respect in hallways. And I had been chosen to lead it. I remember the day my direct supervisor, Julian Mott, gave me the assignment. Julian was a man who looked like he'd been born in a Brooks Brothers suit, all sharp angles and calculated smiles. He had this way of making a compliment sound like a warning. "Nova," he'd said, leaning against my office doorframe. "You're getting Oriole. You're organized. Your KPIs are always green, and you don't get bogged down in chatter." He paused, letting the implication land. "You were chosen because you're quiet and you're punctual. You get the work done without making waves. That's what we need on this. No waves." At the time, I took it as the highest praise a man like Julian could offer. I was a reliable asset, a silent, efficient engine. I didn't realize he was handing me a leash and calling it a crown. Mason, of course, had seen it differently. He'd seen it as our golden ticket. We'd celebrated that night at a ridiculously expensive restaurant where the plates were bigger than the portions. "This is it, Nova," he'd said. his hand covering mine across the starched white tablecloth, his eyes shining with an ambition that mirrored my own. "This is your chance to get in front of my father, not as my fiancé, but as a peer. Just impress him with this project. Show him how sharp you are. Your career will take off. Our future will be set." I'd believed him. I'd held on to that vision, the partnership track, the life we were building, the idea that my hard work would be rewarded with a seat at the table. I was so focused on the destination that I ignored the rot in the road getting there. The first crack appeared 3 weeks ago, in an internal pre-briefing for the Elliston presentation. It was a small room, smelling of stale coffee and whiteboard markers. Just me, Julian, and 2 senior analysts from my team. We were going over Section 7. Julian was scrolling through the document on the main screen, his finger tapping his chin. "This subsection," he said, pointing to 7.2a. "The part about mandatory, real-time safety audits for all third-party contractors. It feels a little rigid." I stiffened. "It's meant to be rigid. Julian, it closes a loophole that allows contractors to bypass our core safety protocols to meet quotas." "I understand," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "But the word mandatory can be inflammatory in a negotiation. It sounds like an ultimatum. What if we softened it, changed it to strongly recommended?" My 2 analysts looked down at their laptops, suddenly fascinated by their spreadsheets. They knew a power play when they saw one. This was my test. Julian was asking me to trade the safety of nameless, faceless workers for a smoother negotiation with a billionaire. He was asking me to make a wave, or let him punch a hole in the hull of my own project. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a gunshot. "We're not blurring safety standards. Oriole is about creating clarity, not plausible deniability. It stays as is." Julian's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold. It was a look I'd never seen from him before. "Your call, Nova," he said lightly. "You're the lead." But the message was clear. You've just made a wave, and waves have consequences. The first consequence arrived 2 days later. It was an email, sent at 2:17 a.m. from a Proton address with no name. The subject line was just a string of numbers. Inside, there was no text, only a single, password-protected zip file. My gut clenched. This was the kind of email that ended careers. After running it through 3 different security scans on an isolated machine, I opened it. It contained dozens of spreadsheets. They were raw payroll logs from an Elliston processing plant in a place I'd never heard of, Rook County. Alongside them were another set of logs, the official ones. The discrepancy was sickeningly obvious. In the official logs, hundreds of hourly workers were clocked out automatically at the end of their scheduled shifts. In the raw logs, they were still working, sometimes for another 2 or 3 hours, unpaid. The metadata indicated the time clock system was being manually overridden, night after night. It was systematic wage theft, meticulously documented. My hands were shaking. I immediately scheduled a one-on-one with Julian. I laid out the data on his desk, the printouts stark in black and white. "We need to flag this to Elliston's compliance team," I said, my voice tight, "and we need to recommend an immediate, unannounced audit of the Rook County facility." Julian didn't even look at the papers. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Nova, we are consultants. We are not internal affairs investigators. We have received an anonymous, unverified data dump. To act on it would be reckless." "Reckless? Julian, this is grand larceny. These are their most vulnerable employees." "And the merger with Elliston is our most valuable deal," he countered, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "We proceed with the official data we've been given. We can address potential discrepancies after the merger is complete." "After it's complete? By then, this will be our problem, not just theirs. We'll be complicit." That's when the shift happened. The carefully constructed facade of the supportive mentor crumbled, and I saw the corporate animal underneath. The praise vanished. The warnings began. "Don't get on a moral high horse. Nova, he'd said in a subsequent meeting, cutting me off when I tried to raise the issue again. A week later, after I submitted a formal risk assessment flagging potential labor law violations, he called me into his office. "You need to decide if you want to be a crusader or a consultant," he warned. "Don't be so ethical you kill the deal for everyone. Your future at this firm depends on your ability to see the bigger picture." The bigger picture, he meant the money, the commission, the prestige. My integrity was just a line item on a budget, and he was telling me to cut it. That was the day I started recording our meetings. Huxley and Frey policy, in a rare nod to transparency, allowed for the recording of any meeting for note-taking and archival purposes, provided all parties were verbally notified at the start. It was a rule no one ever used. It was considered aggressive. But I was done being quiet. At the start of my next meeting with Julian, I placed my phone on the table. "For the purposes of accurate minute keeping, this meeting is being recorded," I stated, my voice a flat monotone. The look on his face was a mixture of shock and fury. He couldn't object. It was in the employee handbook, Section 4, subsection B. But from that moment on, our conversations became a sterile dance of corporate speak, each of us hyper-aware that our words were being etched into a permanent record. Lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling while Mason slept soundly beside me, the feeling was no longer a vague suspicion. It was a certainty. Someone was setting a trap for me. The anonymous email, Julian's sudden hostility, the mounting pressure to compromise my own work. It was all connected. They weren't just trying to silence me, they were trying to maneuver me into a position where I would be forced to fail. They needed a reason to discredit me, and by extension, to discredit the inconvenient truths in Project Oriole. A time trap, a punctuality test, something simple, binary, and easy to weaponize in a performance review, something that would allow them to say, "Well, she was brilliant, but she just wasn't reliable. She couldn't even make the most important meeting of her career on time." My gaze snapped back to the present, to the cold, judgmental faces in the Meridian boardroom, to Grant's Rolex, to Mason's averted eyes, to Kira's smug satisfaction. It was all so clear now. They hadn't expected me to stop for the man on the street, but they had expected me to fail somehow. My 17-minute delay wasn't the crime. It was the weapon they had been waiting for me to hand them. They thought they were about to witness my execution. What they didn't know was that in those 17 minutes on that rainy street corner, I hadn't just bandaged a man's hand. I had found a whole new arsenal, and the trial was just beginning. The world had shrunk to the space of a few square feet of wet pavement. The city's noise, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, the distant wail of a siren, faded into a dull roar. In front of me, the old man shifted, the cheap fabric of his jacket rustling. He looked at the clean white gauze on his hand as if it were a foreign object. "Been a while since anyone's done something like that," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, the sound of disuse. He flexed his fingers carefully. Marlowe Pike." "Nova Vol," I replied, getting to my feet and brushing the damp grit from my knees. He looked me up and down, a slow, appraising gaze that missed nothing. His eyes were clouded with cataracts, but behind the milky film, they were intensely sharp, intelligent. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and was forced to see even more. "You military?" he asked. "No, sir." "You got the look, the way you focus, the way you tied that knot." He held up his hand. "Field dressing, textbook." He grunted and pushed himself up slightly, leaning against the cold brick wall behind him. As his sleeve pulled back, I saw it. On the thin, wrinkled skin of his inner wrist, a faded tattoo of an eagle, its wings spread wide. The ink was blurred, the edges soft with age, but the image was unmistakable. Below it, I could just make out the ghost of a number. 19th Division, he confirmed, seeing where I was looking. "Long time ago, different life." He coughed, a dry hacking sound that shook his frail frame. Echo, the German shepherd, pressed closer to his side. a living brace. After that, I did civilian work. For a while. Anyway, server maintenance. Kept the big digital brains humming. He paused, his gaze turning distant again, as if scanning a horizon only he could see. Worked for a subcontractor, outfit called Emblem Facilities. The name meant nothing to me. It was one of thousands of anonymous LLCs that formed the sprawling, labyrinthine network of corporate America. We had a contract, Marlowe continued, his voice dropping lower, becoming more conspiratorial, servicing the main data hubs for Elliston Meridian. My blood went cold. The name hit me like a physical blow. Elliston, here, on this grimy street corner, spoken by this forgotten man. It couldn't be a coincidence. The universe wasn't that small or that cruel. I kept my face a perfect mask of polite neutrality, a skill honed in countless boardrooms. Elliston's a big company, I said, my voice carefully non-committal. Marlowe gave a short, bitter laugh. Big is one word for it. He reached into the cavernous pocket of his coat, his good hand fumbling for a moment before he pulled something out. He pressed it into my palm. It was a small, thin piece of aluminum, its edges worn smooth, cool against my skin. It felt like a worry stone. Stamped into the metal was a single word, in a clean, sans serif font. Emblem, below it, an employee ID number. My team ID, he said. They made us wear them, said it built camaraderie, he snorted. Then they cut the whole contract, said it was for cost efficiency, threw about 30 of us out of work with a week's notice, said we were redundant. I stared at the small metal tag in my hand. Emblem, a name, a lead. It felt heavier than it should, freighted with the weight of untold stories. Marlowe leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. You know, Echo here. He's a service dog for my PTSD. He can't sleep when there are loud, unexpected noises, and in that last month at the Rook County plant, he never slept. My heart hammered against my ribs. Rook County? The name from the anonymous spreadsheets. The press machines in the warehouse next to the server farm. They were supposed to shut down for maintenance at midnight, but they never did. They ran all night, every night, squealing and groaning like dying animals. The sound got through 3 feet of concrete. Echo couldn't sleep, and neither could we. It was happening. The disparate, ugly pieces of the puzzle were flying together, drawn by an invisible magnetism. The wage theft in Rook County, the overworked, unpaid employees, a contractor team named Emblem, servicing servers right next to the source of the noise, and this man, Marlowe Pike, sitting in the rain, a casualty of it all. You're one of them, aren't you? He asked, his voice a low whisper. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact. The people in the glass towers, you work in data, don't you? I can see it. You have that look, like you're always calculating. I could only nod, my throat suddenly tight. He let out a long, weary sigh, a cloud of vapor in the cold air. Then you need to see this. His hand went back into his coat pocket. This time, he brought out something that made my professional instincts scream. It was a standard USB flash drive, but its bright plastic casing had been snapped off, exposing the raw circuit board and memory chip. It looked like it had been deliberately broken, perhaps to be hidden somewhere small, or to make it look like a piece of trash. It was an object of pure desperate data exfiltration. Can't get it to work on the library computers, he said. They say it's broken, but I don't think it is. I think it just needs the right machine, the right hands. He held it out to me. My mind raced, cataloging the risks. Taking this was a breach of a dozen corporate protocols. It was unverified. It was a potential security threat. It was professional suicide if it was a setup. But I looked at his face, at the desperate hope warring with decades of disappointment in his eyes. I looked at the broken piece of technology in his hand, and I thought of the stolen hours on those spreadsheets, of Julian Mott's cold dismissal, of Mason's ambition. I thought of the choice I had to make. My hand was steady as I took the drive from him. I immediately pulled a small, anti-static, moisture-proof bag from my briefcase, part of my standard kit for handling sensitive evidence, and sealed the drive inside. "I'll look at it," I promised. "I can't promise what I'll find, or what I can do, but I'll look. That's all I'm asking." I took out a business card and a pen. I flipped the card over to its blank white back and wrote down my personal cell number. "I have to go to a meeting," I said, handing it to him. "But I want to hear the rest of this story. There's a soup kitchen at Quaker Row. They serve a hot meal at 7 tonight. Can you meet me there?" He looked at the card, then back at me. A flicker of something, suspicion, maybe, or just surprise, crossed his face. "You'll show up?" "I'll show up," I said, and I meant it. As I turned to leave, Echo, who had been silent and watchful this whole time, stood up. He walked toward me and gently pushed his wet nose into my hand, sniffing the lingering scent of gauze and antiseptic. Then he looked up at me and let out a single, soft, woof. It wasn't a bark of aggression or fear. It was a sound of acknowledgement, a reminder, "Don't forget us. Don't let this be for nothing." I reached down and stroked his noble head one last time. Getting into the waiting cab. The decision had already been made. It had been made the moment I chose to kneel on that sidewalk. I was going to be late. I was going to walk into that boardroom and face the silent, wrathful judgment of Grant Elliston and my fiancé. I was going to endure the condescension and the professional consequences, because the alternative, to have walked away from Marlowe and Echo, to have prioritized my career over a man's bleeding hand and a dog's quiet loyalty, was unthinkable. It would have meant becoming one of them. It would have meant that the person I saw in the mirror every morning was a lie. The cab sped through the city, a yellow blur against the gray. I watched the rain-streaked streets fly by. My mind a whirlwind. The emblem tag felt heavy in my pocket. The sealed bag with the broken USB felt like a ticking bomb in my briefcase. This was no longer just about wage theft. This was about a cover-up, about a group of workers who were silenced, about a man and his dog, left to fend for themselves on the street as a reward for knowing too much. When I finally stepped out of the cab and walked into the lobby of the Elliston Meridian Tower, I was 17 minutes late, as I rode that glass elevator up into the sky, away from the street and the rain and the real world. I caught my reflection in the polished glass. I saw the damp hair clinging to my temples, the watermark on my dress, the fatigue in my eyes, and for the first time in my entire career, I felt absolutely no shame. I wasn't a disheveled employee who had failed a test of punctuality. I was a strategist who had just received the most important piece of intelligence of her life, and I was ready for war. The air in the room was a vacuum, sucking all the warmth and life out of me. My statement, "I was choosing to be human first," hung between us, an obscene and unwelcome sentiment in this temple of commerce. Grant Elliston simply stared at me, his face an unreadable mask of granite. He didn't acknowledge my words. He didn't have to. Contempt was his native language, and he was fluent in its silence. Instead, he made a small, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand. On the massive screen behind him, the Elliston Meridian logo dissolved, replaced by the first slide of a presentation. The title, in a bold, aggressive font, was a declaration of war. "Why we don't need Oriole. A streamlined path to integration." It was a public execution, with the cool, detached air of a surgeon removing a tumor. Grant began to speak, his voice a low, resonant purr that did nothing to hide the steel beneath it. He clicked through the slides, each one a precise, calculated blow designed to dismantle the entire foundation of my work. "As you can see," he began, a laser pointer appearing in his hand, its red dot dancing on the screen. "Project Oriole, while admirable in its thoroughness, introduces significant operational redundancies." Click, a slide appeared showing a complex flowchart from my report, overlaid with thick red X's. It proposes a compliance framework that would add, by our estimate, a 17% overhead in personnel and a 22% delay in supply chain integration during the crucial first 2 quarters post-merger. Click, a slide with terrifying-looking financial projections in red. It fails to leverage existing synergies between the H&F and Elliston reporting systems, instead opting to build a new, untested architecture from the ground up. He spoke for 10 minutes, never once looking at me. He was performing for an audience of 2, Kira, his CFO, who nodded along with grim satisfaction, and Mason, his son, who sat rigid in his chair. Grant was systematically taking 6 months of my life, the all-nighters, the weekends spent poring over international labor laws, the endless debates with my team over the ethics of algorithmic oversight, and reducing it to a set of inconvenient, expensive, and naive bullet points. He made my work sound not just flawed, but foolish. It was then that Mason, my fiancé, the man who had held my hand and told me this project would make my career, chose to speak. He cleared his throat, a small, nervous sound in the cavernous room. "Dad, Grant," he began, his voice strained. "Perhaps we should consider that Nova's been under a great deal of pressure lately." I turned to look at him, a cold dread coiling in my stomach. Wedding planning and other personal matters. She might not be as focused as she usually is. The words struck me with the force of a physical slap. It was the ultimate betrayal, wrapped in the guise of concern. In one fell swoop, he had dismissed me as a professional, reframing my principles as the emotional distraction of a stressed-out bride. He wasn't defending my work. He was apologizing for my womanhood. He was telling his father that my lapse in punctuality and my stubborn idealism were not the calculated choices of a strategist, but the flighty, irrational behavior of an overwrought fiancé. The room temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Kira Holt's lips twitched into a barely perceptible smirk. She had won. The son was siding with the father. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I didn't even look at Mason. To acknowledge his words would be to validate them. Instead, I calmly reached down and opened my briefcase. I pulled out 4 slim-bound documents. They were not the full 300-page Oriole report. They were a 10-page executive summary, the kind designed for people with no time and even less patience. I had prepared them for exactly this moment. I stood and walked the length of the table, placing a copy directly in front of Grant, then Kira, then Mason. I saved the last copy for the silent man in the corner, a man I now recognized as Martin Wexler, Elliston's general counsel. He took it with a slight nod, his eyes curious. I returned to my seat. "If you'll turn to page 6, I said, my voice steady, "you'll see the risk analysis summary." On the pages, a few key sections were highlighted in a brilliant, almost violent yellow, impossible to ignore. Section 7.2a, Mandatory Contractor Safety Audits. Section 8.4, Anonymous Whistleblower Protections. Section 9.1, Third-Party Payroll Data Integrity. I had forced the uncomfortable truth into their hands. They could no longer pretend it didn't exist. Grant looked down at the document, his eyes scanning the highlighted sections. He read them, then read them again. The silence stretched, thick and taut. He slowly lifted his head, his gaze boring into me. The boardroom performance was over. This was no longer a presentation. It was an interrogation. "Let me ask you a direct question. Ms. Vale," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "In a deal of this magnitude, with billions of dollars and thousands of jobs on the line, what is your highest priority?" This was the test, the real one. My answer would define everything. I didn't hesitate. I didn't need to. The answer was forged in the cold rain on Argent and Fourth. "The safety of real people, Mr. Elliston," I replied, my voice clear and even. "The profit margin comes second." A beat of perfect, shocked silence. And then, Grant Elliston laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It was a short, sharp, ugly burst of sound, devoid of all humor. It was the sound of a predator who had just confirmed the weakness of its prey. "Then you'll never lead a merger," he said, the words a final, damning judgment. He tossed the summary onto the table as if it were contaminated. You don't have the Constitution for it. You're an academic, not a leader. Kira Holt saw her opening and seized it. She leaned forward, her expression a careful pantomime of collaborative problem-solving. Grant, perhaps we're being too rigid, she said, her voice like honey laced with arsenic. Nova's framework has some interesting ideas. Maybe it's not a matter of yes or no. Maybe it's just a matter of language. She looked at me. Instead of mandatory, we could use guidelines. Instead of audit, we could use review. It would give us the flexibility we need to operate without tying our hands with unnecessary red tape. It was the oldest trick in the corporate playbook, the slow, methodical erosion of meaning until the words that were meant to be a shield for the powerless become a weapon for the powerful. This was my cue. I calmly reached for my phone, placed it on the granite table, and tapped the screen. A small red light began to blink. For the purposes of accurate minute keeping, as per Section 4B of the Huxley and Frey Partnership Agreement, this meeting is now being recorded, I announced into the silence. Grant's eyes flashed with fury. Kira's jaw tightened. Mason looked as if he was going to be physically ill. I glanced at Martin Wexler. The lawyer gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He knew the rules. He knew my action was legally sound, both by my firm's policies and by state law regarding two-party consent in a private meeting where consent had been established as a condition of doing business. I had just checkmated them. Every word they said from this point forward was on the record. I turned my attention back to Kira. If your flexible language results in a worker at the Rook County facility getting his hand caught in a press machine because a safety shield was removed to boost output, I said, my voice low and intense, we are all complicit. If your guidelines allow a subcontractor to steal 3 hours of wages from 100 employees every single night, we are all complicit. And that complicity, I finished, tapping my finger on the table next to my recording phone, will now be on the record. The mention of Rook County was a shot across the bow, and from the flicker in their eyes, I knew it had hit its mark. Grant Elliston had heard enough. He was a king in his castle, and a peasant had just stormed the throne room. He stood up, the motion sharp and final. He was taking back control. This meeting is over, he stated, his voice flat and cold as a morgue slab. Your proposal, Ms. Vale, is rejected. In its entirety, he looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the true reptilian coldness behind his eyes. Furthermore, at the H&F Partnership dinner this evening, I will be speaking with Julian Mott and the other senior partners. I will be giving them my strongest possible recommendation that you be immediately removed from the Elliston account. Your lack of judgment and unprofessional conduct have made your position untenable. He had done it. He had taken my 17 minutes of humanity and twisted them into a fireable offense. He had used my own principles as the justification for my professional demise. Through it all, as the verdict was delivered and my career was sentenced to death, I looked at Mason. This was it. This was the moment, the last possible second for him to stand up, to say something, anything, to say, Dad, that's not fair, to say, Nova is the most principled person I know, to even just look at me with an ounce of solidarity. He did nothing. He stared at the glossy surface of the granite table as if it held the most fascinating secrets in the world. He straightened his already perfect tie. He cleared his screen, which was already blank. He did anything and everything except meet my gaze. His silence was louder than Grant's condemnation. It was a complete and total abdication. And in that deafening silence, I felt something inside my chest, something I had thought was strong and unbreakable. Crack. It was a clean, sharp fracture, right down the middle. It was the sound of a future dissolving. It was the sound of an engagement ring suddenly feeling like a lead weight on my finger. It was the sound of me, finally, being completely and utterly alone. The walk from the Elliston Tower back to my apartment was a blur. I ignored the messages lighting up my phone, a cascade of false concern from Mason and a single, curt summons from Julian, They were flies buzzing around a corpse, and I had no time for them. I felt the crack in my chest not as a wound, but as a space opening up, letting in a cold, clear draft of purpose. The engagement ring on my finger felt alien. I twisted it off and dropped it into the side pocket of my briefcase. One problem at a time. Evening found me at Quaker Row, a place that felt a universe away from the granite and glass of my day. It was a brightly lit church basement, filled with the clatter of trays, the steam from industrial-sized soup pots, and 100 overlapping conversations. It smelled of bleach, boiled potatoes, and wet wool. It was chaotic, loud, and deeply, achingly human. I saw Marlowe at a small table in the corner, a bowl of stew untouched in front of him. Echo was lying at his feet, a stoic, furry guardian. I sat down opposite him. He looked up, and his eyes, for all their cloudiness, were sharp. He studied my face, searching for the outcome of my meeting. "It went as expected," I said, answering his unasked question. He just nodded, a grim understanding passing between us. He had seen this story play out before. He slid a worn, leather-covered notebook across the table. Tucked inside was another USB drive. This one was intact, a standard black plastic stick, but it looked just as out of place here as a diamond. "The first one I gave you, that was my personal stash," he said, his voice barely a whisper above the din. "Notes I took, a few photos of the machine logs on my phone, things I grabbed when I knew the end was coming." He tapped the notebook. This is from the inside. A friend on the IT floor. Just before he quit, he pulled it straight from the local server. It's the official record, or both versions of it, He didn't need to say more. I took the drive, the quiet weight of it a stark contrast to the boardroom's hollow words. I pushed a small, sealed envelope across the table. It contained a few $100s in cash and several prepaid transit cards. "For food and a warm place to stay," I said. "And for Echo." For the first time, I saw a flicker of emotion in Marlowe's guarded expression. He looked down at the envelope, then back at me. "My team," he said, his voice thick. "We saw the time logs being shaved, a few minutes here, an hour there. We filed a formal complaint with the site manager. We thought we were doing the right thing." He gave a bitter, hollow laugh. 2 weeks later, Elliston's regional office terminated Emblem's contract, cost efficiency. They said. The site manager filed a report against Echo, said he was a disruptive animal, barking at the machinery, tried to get his service credentials revoked. They weren't just firing us, they were trying to erase us, to make sure no one would ever listen to us again. Back in my apartment, with the glittering, indifferent lights of Caldera spread out below my window, I went to work. The broken USB from the morning was first. It was a delicate operation, requiring a pair of tweezers and a special adapter to carefully align the exposed contacts. It was, as Marlowe said, his personal stash. Photos of handwritten maintenance logs, a blurry picture of a safety warning that had been covered with black tape, an audio file, just a few seconds long, capturing the deafening shriek of a machine under strain. It was context, it was color, but it wasn't proof. Then, I plugged in the second drive. My laptop recognized it instantly. A single folder sat on the drive. ELMRC facility. Inside, my blood ran cold. It was exactly as Marlowe's friend had left it. Time log raw, CSV. Time log adjusted, CSV. Press schedule master, XLSX. And a fourth file, a PDF of a contract. Subcon agreement Elm Shadow, PDF. I opened the raw time logs first. They were a simple, brutal record of human effort. Employee ID, clock-in time, clock-out time, thousands of entries. Then I opened the adjusted logs. It was the same file, but different. I ran a differential analysis script. The differences lit up my screen in red. For any shift that ran past its scheduled end time, the clock-out was automatically and uniformly reset to the exact minute the shift was supposed to have ended. A night shift worker who clocked out at 3:17 a.m. after starting at 6 p.m. was officially logged as clocking out at 2:00 a.m., an hour and 17 minutes of labor. Gone, for one person. I scrolled down. There were hundreds of names. I dug into the file's metadata. The change history told the story. A script named OT Scrubbers v2.py had been run on the file every single day at 5:01 a.m. It was automated theft on an industrial scale. I did a quick calculation based on a sample of 100 employees over 1 month. The average reduction in paid hours was just over 18%, an entire day's wage, stolen from every worker, every single week. Next, the contract. I opened the PDF. It was a standard subcontractor agreement, dense with legalese. The client was listed as Elliston Meridian. The contractor was listed as Emblem Facilities, but in the appendices, under a section detailing data access protocols, was a code I'd never seen before. Contract ID LM Shadow. This wasn't a standard vendor code. This was the digital equivalent of an off-the-books slush fund. It was a designation for a deniable asset, a corporate entity designed to exist in the shadows, taking on the dirty work and absorbing the liability. My hands flew across the keyboard. I pulled up the encrypted files from the anonymous email I had received weeks ago. They contained payroll data, not time logs. I wrote a quick script to cross-reference the employee ID numbers and pay periods from the anonymous data with the wage theft I'd just uncovered in Marlowe's logs. I hit enter. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the results flooded the screen. Match found. Correlation. 99.8%. It was all there. It was all true. I had them. My mind was racing. This was bigger than a breach of contract. It was a criminal conspiracy. I needed legal counsel, and not the kind H&F's internal team, compromised by their thirst for the Elliston deal, could provide. I pulled up a secure messaging app and contacted a name I hadn't used in years. Reese Colton. Reese was a scorched-earth labor lawyer, a lone wolf who had gone up against a dozen Fortune 500 companies and won. He worked late. He answered on the second ring, his face appearing on my screen, sharp and alert, even at this hour. "Nova," he said. "No pleasantries. This must be good." For 20 minutes, I laid it all out. The logs, the contract, the Elm Shadow code, the anonymous email. I sent him the key files through an encrypted channel. He was silent, absorbing it all. "It's a strong case for wage and hour violations," he finally said. His eyes narrowed in concentration. "A class action suit waiting to happen. But it's financial. They'll settle. They'll write a check and their stock will dip for a day. If you want to really hurt them, you need more." "What's more?" I asked. "You need to prove that their cost-cutting wasn't just illegal. It was dangerous. You have to connect the wage theft to a direct endangerment of the workers. If you can find proof of them forcing unsafe overtime, creating a hazardous work environment to feed the machine, then you have a case that brings in the federal regulators. That's a case that doesn't just cost them money, it costs them their reputation. It can trigger debarment from government contracts. That's the kill shot." I felt a surge of frustration. How could I prove that? Then, like a flash of lightning, the morning came rushing back to me. The image of Marlowe's hand, the knuckles raw and bloody, the cheap, thin gauze I'd wrapped around them. "What happened to your hand?" I'd asked him. "One of the cutting machines," he'd said, his voice distant. "Vibrates like hell since they took the main safety guard off. Said it slowed down the line speeds." The words echoed in my head. They took the main safety guard off. "Reese," I said, my voice electric with sudden clarity. "I think I have it." After ending the call, I opened one last file, my own, Project Oriole. I navigated to the risk analysis section, the very part Grant Elliston had dismissed as academic nonsense, months ago. My team had built a predictive risk map of Elliston's facilities based on their own self-reported maintenance schedules and incident reports. I pulled up the map for the Rook County plant. It was covered in color-coded zones, green for low risk, yellow for caution, red for high risk of mechanical failure or operator injury. Then I opened the press schedule/master XLSX file from Marlowe's drive. It showed the operational hours for every heavy machine in the facility. I wrote one final, simple piece of code, a script to create a visual overlay, plotting the overtime hours of the press and cutting machines from Marlowe's data onto my Oriole risk map. I executed the script. The result was instantaneous and horrifying. A spiderweb of angry red lines, representing the forced, unpaid overtime, spread across the map, and every single line fell squarely, perfectly, within the high-risk zones I had already identified. The machines being pushed past their limits were the same ones my own analysis had flagged as the most dangerous. It was the smoking gun, and I had built the gun myself. I leaned back in my chair, the screen's glow reflecting in my eyes. The path forward was no longer a tangled mess of possibilities. It was a single, straight line. Grant Elliston wanted me off the project. Julian Mott wanted me to be quiet and punctual. Mason wanted me to be a supportive, invisible fiancé. They had all misjudged me. They thought they were pushing me off a cliff. They didn't realize they had just given me everything I needed to fly. The decision formed. Hard and clear as diamond. The partnership dinner was tomorrow night. They expected me to be silent, to be sidelined, to be fired. They would not be expecting me to come armed with proof of their entire criminal enterprise. I wasn't going to leak this to a regulator. I wasn't going to hand it off to Reese and walk away. I was going to detonate this in the center of their world, live and in person, right in front of their faces. The rest of the night was a blur of caffeine and cold fury. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. My apartment, usually a sanctuary of calm minimalism, transformed into a war room. The battle wasn't scheduled to begin for another 24 hours at the Huxley and Frey partnership dinner. But every war is won or lost in the preparation that precedes it. I was no longer a consultant preparing a proposal. I was a strategist laying a siege. Every action was a chess move, every detail a carefully placed stone in the foundation of the reckoning to come. My first move was to secure my star witness. I couldn't just have Marlowe Pike show up at the door of one of the most exclusive corporate buildings in Caldera. He would be turned away. Another piece of human debris swept aside by uniformed security. I needed to bring him inside using their own rules. I powered on my work laptop and logged into the H&F internal network. I navigated through the labyrinthine corporate intranet to the section on company bylaws and social responsibility policies. It was a digital wasteland of PR-friendly jargon that most employees ignored. But I had a photographic memory for regulations, a skill that had always made me an effective, if unexciting, strategist, and I remembered something. There it was. Bylaw 217, the Community Guest Initiative. It was an obscure clause, likely drafted by a summer intern in the communications department a decade ago, designed to allow employees to invite a member of the public to certain company functions to foster community integration and corporate transparency. It had probably never been used. It was perfect. I drafted a formal request and sent it to building management and the event coordinator for the partnership dinner. Pursuant to Bylaw 217, I wrote, I am formally extending an invitation to Mr. Marlowe Pike, a distinguished veteran and community member, to attend the opening reception of tomorrow's partnership dinner as my community guest. Please have credentials waiting for him at the front desk. I cede the entire H&F Executive Committee. To deny the request would be a violation of their own laughably hollow transparency policy. They were trapped by their own virtue signaling. Check. Next, I built my weapon. I wasn't going to walk in there with a scattered collection of files and accusations. I needed a spear, something sharp, focused, and impossible to defend against. I created a new presentation deck, 10 slides, no more. The title was Project Oriole, Delta Analysis. Delta, the mathematical symbol for change. This was the evolution of my work. From a set of recommendations into a body of evidence. The design was stark, minimalist black and white, using H&F's own branding. I stripped out all emotion, all personal commentary. The deck was a cold, sterile indictment of a system, not a person. Slide 1 was an infographic showing the 18% wage gap in Rook County, anonymized but sourced. Slide 2 detailed the automated script used to alter time logs. Slide 3 was a simplified diagram of the LM shadow contract structure, showing how Emblem Facilities was used as a liability shield. The most damning slide was number 7, my Oriole risk map of the Rook County plant, with the press machine overtime schedules layered on top. The correlation wasn't just clear, it was a bloody handprint at a crime scene. This wasn't a personal attack, it was a clinical diagnosis of a corporate cancer. But evidence is only as good as its integrity. They would try to discredit my sources, claim the data was faked or altered, so I took the final, crucial step. I bundled all of it: the raw logs, the contract, the audio recordings from my phone, the anonymous email files, every last piece of data, into a single encrypted container. I then used a public, blockchain-based service to generate a SHA-256 hash of the container. It created a unique, 40-character digital fingerprint. Any change to the files, no matter how small, would alter the hash, proving tampering. I then had that hash time-stamped on the public ledger. It was the digital equivalent of carving the evidence in stone and planting it in the middle of the town square. It was now irrefutable, its existence and timestamp a matter of public record. On the final slide of my Delta Oriole deck, I placed a single, large QR code, the key to the vault. Checkmate. With the tactical pieces in place, I turned to the psychological. I needed to ensure all the players were on the board. Specifically, Mason. I picked up my personal phone, my fingers hovering over his name. The raw, emotional part of me wanted to scream at him, to demand an explanation for his cowardice. But the strategist in me knew that was a losing move. I needed him there, and I needed him unsuspecting. I typed a message, carefully crafting each word to appeal to his ambition and his monumental underestimation of me. Mason, I've had a breakthrough on the Elliston account. I've revised my proposal. Be at the H&F dinner early tomorrow night. I have an update that will make you proud. I hit send, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. His reply came back in less than a minute, a testament to his addiction to his phone. It was as cold and dismissive as his silence in the boardroom had been. Good. Keep it concise. Not a single question, no curiosity, no concern, just a directive. He still saw me as a subordinate, a functionary whose job was to produce work that reflected well on him. He had no idea he was a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. Now, for my own side of the board, it was time to put Huxley and Frey on formal notice. I opened my work email and composed a new message. The recipient was the head of our internal legal department. I CC'd the firm's designated ethics and compliance officer. The subject line was simple: meeting record for archival. In the body, I wrote one sentence: please find attached the audio recording from my 8:30 a.m. meeting today with the Elliston Meridian executive team for your records. I attached the file. It was a quiet, professional, and utterly damning declaration. I was starting the clock. Julian's response was almost instantaneous. A panicked message sent directly to my private chat. Nova, what are you doing? Don't bring unvetted leaks into a formal boardroom setting. You're playing with fire. It was a threat, cloaked in the language of a concerned mentor. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about the deal, and about the splashback that would hit him. I looked at his words, and felt nothing but a profound, weary pity. He was still playing by the old rules, even as the game board was being flipped over. I typed my reply, a single sentence that was both a promise and a statement of fact. We are the leak, Julian, if we choose to ignore it. I hit send and shut the laptop. The pieces were set. The traps were laid. For a moment, I just sat in the silence of my apartment, the adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving a hollow ache in its place. This cold, calculated campaign, it was necessary, but it was corrosive. I worried it would burn away whatever humanity I had left. I stood up and walked to the window, forcing myself to think of the man who had started it all. I thought of Marlowe Pike, and I thought of Echo. I picked up my phone again, But this time, I didn't open my email or my messages. I opened a web browser and found a 24-hour pet supply store that delivered. I ordered 2 new collars. One was a sturdy, weatherproof nylon for daily wear. The other was handsome, stitched leather. I added a gift voucher to my cart for a full veterinary checkup and grooming at a clinic just a few blocks from Quaker Row. I paid with my personal credit card and had them sent for delivery to the soup kitchen for the next morning, addressed to Marlowe Pike and his service dog, Echo. It was a small gesture in a very large game, but it was my anchor. It was the reminder that this wasn't just about data and contracts and corporate revenge. It was about a man with a bleeding hand and his loyal dog, shivering in the rain. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the distant, silent lights of the city. A fire was burning inside me, but it had changed. It was no longer the panicked flame of a cornered animal. It had become something cold, still, and incredibly dense, like the heart of a star. The need for approval, from Julian, from Grant, from Mason, it was gone. I had spent my entire career trying to prove I was worthy of a seat at their table. What a waste of time. I wasn't asking for their approval anymore. I was establishing a new standard, and tomorrow night, I was going to burn their table to the ground. The Huxley and Frey offices occupied the top 5 floors of a skyscraper that pierced the Caldera skyline like a shard of obsidian. The partnership dinner was being held in the building's pinnacle space, a panoramic event room with glass walls that offered a God's eye view of the city lights. Before the main event, the firm's partners and their most valued clients mingled in the reception area, a long, wide hallway also walled in glass, where the city's glittering tappies became the wallpaper for their ambition. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, the low hum of self-congratulatory chatter, and the clinking of champagne flutes. It was a performance, and tonight, I was scheduled to be the tragic finale. I had arrived early, a deliberate act of defiance against the narrative they had built around my tardiness. I bypassed the champagne, taking a glass of sparkling water instead. I needed my mind to be a razor. I was watching Julian Mott hold court near the windows, his back to me. When a hand touched my elbow, I didn't need to turn to know who it was. "Nova, can I talk to you for a second?" Mason's voice was low, urgent. He steered me away from the small clusters of partners, leading me to a more secluded section of the glass hallway, where a pair of leather armchairs sat like silent witnesses. He looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and the knot of his silk tie seemed to be choking him. "You got my message," I said. It wasn't a question. "I did," he said, his eyes darting around nervously, as if the walls themselves were listening. "So did Julian, and then he called my father. Nova, you have to stop this." He ran a hand through his perfect hair, disrupting it for the first time I could remember. "My father wants you to pull the Delta Oriole deck. He wants you to retract the email you sent to legal and issue a formal apology for your conduct." He was delivering the terms of my surrender, the king's messenger, offering me a chance to kneel before the execution. I looked at his strained, handsome face, the face I had once thought I would wake up to for the rest of my life, and I felt a profound, cavernous emptiness. I asked the only question that mattered. "And what do you want, Mason?" Silence. He broke eye contact immediately, his gaze dropping to the plush, obscenely patterned carpet at our feet. He straightened his cufflinks. He adjusted his watch. He did anything but answer the question. In his silence, I heard everything. I heard his fear, his weakness, his choice. He had chosen his father. He had chosen the empire. He had chosen the path of least resistance. Finally, he looked up, his expression pleading, as if he were the one being wronged. "Nova, you have to understand the position you're putting me in, the position you're putting everyone in." He took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the blow he thought would be the final one. "If you make a scene tonight, if you push this crusade of yours, my father is going to pull the funding for the St. Jude's pediatric wing." I stared at him. The St. Jude's project was a massive philanthropic undertaking, a state-of-the-art hospital wing for the sickest children in the city. And the Elliston Foundation was its primary benefactor. It was Grant's vanity project, the public face of his benevolence, the thing that washed his corporate sins clean in the eyes of the city, and he was using it as a shield, as a hostage. It was a move of such breathtaking cynicism, of such profound moral bankruptcy, that for a moment, I couldn't breathe. He wasn't just blackmailing me with my career. He was blackmailing me with the lives of sick children. He is going to frame it as a necessary cost-cutting measure, Mason continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if he were letting me in on a clever strategy. A response to the instability and potential legal exposure a rogue consultant from H&F has created. He will make you the villain, Nova, the overzealous analyst who cost the city a hospital. And in that moment, I understood everything. Our relationship, our engagement. It was never a partnership of equals. It was a merger. I was an acquisition, a promising asset he was bringing into the family business. And my function, my primary KPI, was to be quiet, to be supportive, to be a seamless and valuable addition to the Elliston brand. My love was conditional, predicated on my compliance. His love was a line item, subordinate to the far more important interests of the family. I looked him straight in the eye, my voice as cold and clear as the glass that surrounded us. Do you know about a company called Emblem Facilities? He flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch in his jaw. But I saw it. He knew. Of course, he knew. He was a VP at the company. He saw the numbers. He knew about the shadow contracts and the cooked books. He knew it all. He recovered quickly, slipping on the mask of weary pragmatism that all-powerful men learn to wear. Nova, that's just how things are done, he said with a dismissive shrug. It's how every major corporation in the world operates. It's a messy business. You can't make a global omelet without breaking a few procedural eggs. Procedural eggs. He was talking about Marlowe's bloody hand. He was talking about hundreds of workers having their wages stolen every single night. He was talking about a man and his dog, thrown onto the street for daring to speak up. All just procedural eggs. That was it. That was the end. The crack in my chest from the day before splintered and shattered, and a strange, calm coldness washed through me. I slowly, deliberately, pulled the engagement ring from my finger. It was a beautiful diamond, heavy and brilliant under the reception hall lights. It felt like a shackle. I took his hand, his skin soft and uncalloused, and I turned it palm up. I placed the ring squarely in the center of his hand. It looked small and obscene there. I will not be another quiet cog in your father's machine, I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of an oath. I closed his fingers around the ring, and I will not be yours. For a second, he just stared at the ring in his fist, a look of genuine shock on his face. He had actually believed his threat would work. He had believed I could be manipulated, that my principles had a price, and that the price was a children's hospital. Then, as I turned to walk away, panic flared in his eyes. He reached out, his fingers closing around my wrist. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a grip of possession, of ownership. Nova, stop, he pleaded, his voice a harsh whisper. Don't do this. Don't destroy yourself just to make a point. Throw my future away. The thought was fascinating. In his world, my refusal to accept his family's unethical practices was an act of self-sabotage. My integrity was a liability. My strength was a character flaw. I looked down at his hand on my wrist, then back up to his face. I didn't pull away. I simply stood there, my gaze unwavering, until the wrongness of what he was doing dawned on him. His grip loosened, and his hand fell away. I turned and walked away from him without another word. Each step was lighter than the one before, the weight I had been carrying for months, the pressure to please, the need to impress, the burden of his family's expectations, the lie of our shared future. It all fell away. It was like putting down a suitcase full of lead I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Halfway down the hall, I passed a massive, floor-to-ceiling mirror, its gilded frame absurdly ornate. I caught a glimpse of my own reflection, a woman in a simple, dark dress, her hair pulled back, her face pale but her eyes on fire. It was a Nova I barely recognized. She wasn't looking for approval. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't waiting for a man to validate her existence. She was standing perfectly straight, entirely on her own. I reached the doors to the main event room. I didn't look back. I knew Mason was still standing there, a ghost in a glass hallway, holding the wreckage of our future in the palm of his hand. I pulled out my phone, my fingers steady. I brought up my secure chat with Reese Colton. I typed 2 sentences. "It's on. Be on standby." I hit send. Then I pushed open the doors and walked into the lion's den. The main boardroom at Huxley & Frey was designed to project power. The centerpiece was a 30-foot table of polished, book-matched mahogany, so glossy it reflected the coffered ceiling and the muted city lights like a dark, still lake. It was a space for corporate warfare, and the battle lines had been drawn. On one side sat Grant Elliston's delegation. Grant himself, enthroned at the center, with a smugly triumphant Kira Holt and a pale, hollowed-out Mason flanking him. On the other side sat the Huxley & Frey senior partners, led by Julian Mott. I sat at the end of the table, an army of one, positioned between the 2 opposing forces. In the corner of the room, a small, discreet camera on the wall glowed with a tiny, vigilant red light, recording the official minutes of my execution. The polite fiction of the pre-dinner reception was over. The champagne flutes had been cleared away. The mood was glacial. Julian, as my direct superior and the official host, cleared his throat to begin. The sound was amplified by the sensitive boardroom microphones, making it sound like a nervous cough. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice tight and overly formal. "Before we proceed to the final merger discussion, there is an internal H&F personnel matter that needs to be addressed, given its potential impact on the Elliston account." He adjusted his papers, refusing to look at me. "Due to recent events, including significant concerns around discipline and punctuality, we are formally considering a change in the team leadership for Project Oriole to ensure a seamless and successful integration moving forward." It was a masterclass in corporate assassination. He had framed my stand as a simple HR issue. I was not a whistleblower. I was a tardy and problematic employee. He was creating the official board-approved narrative that would justify my removal. He was sanitizing the crime. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mason. He wasn't looking at the proceedings. He was staring down at his laptop, his face illuminated by the screen's cold blue light. From my angle, I could just make out the document he had open. It was an email draft. The subject line was stark and brutal. "Transition plan. Nova Vale out." Below it were bullet points. "Immediate knowledge transfer to Mark Renshaw. Secure all project data. Draft communications for Elliston Team Re. Leadership change." He was composing my professional obituary before my body was even cold. The last, fragile ember of hope that some part of the man I had loved still existed was finally extinguished. Julian was about to continue, to move to a vote, to seal my fate, but I wasn't going to let him. "Mr. Mott," I said, my voice clear and calm, cutting through his prepared remarks. The entire room turned to look at me. According to Section 9 of the Huxley & Frey Partnership Bylaws, a project lead has the right to address the board directly on any matter pertaining to their project's integrity. A flicker of panic in Julian's eyes. The firm's secretary, a woman named Carol, who had been with H&F for 40 years and knew the bylaws better than the partners themselves, looked up from her notes. She gave me a slow, deliberate nod. I had the floor. "Thank you, Carol," I said. "I won't need long." I picked up the small remote for the presentation screen. The H&F logo, which had been glowing serenely behind Julian, vanished. It was replaced by the first slide of my Delta Oriole deck. It wasn't a chart. It wasn't a graph. It was a photograph. A high-resolution image of Marlowe Pike's hand, the knuckles raw and split, the skin ingrained with dirt, the angry red of the wound a stark contrast to the clean white of the gauze I had wrapped around it. In the bottom corner of the slide, in a small, clinical font, were 3 lines of text. Injury, laceration from unguarded industrial machinery. Timestamp, 10/17/2025, 11 a.m. Coordinates, 34.0522 Degen, 1182437 DWW. The room was utterly silent. The image was jarring. An unwelcome visitor from the real world. I let it hang there for a full 10 seconds before I spoke. "This is why I was 17 minutes late yesterday," I said, my voice even, my gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the H&F partners, then landing on Grant Elliston. "And this is the true subject of Project Oriole." Click, the next slide appeared. 2 columns of numbers side by side. "On the left," I explained, "you see the raw, unadjusted time clock data from the Rook County facility. On the right, you see the payroll log submitted by Elliston Meridian. As you can see, there is an average discrepancy of 18%, representing systematic wage theft orchestrated by an automated script that scrubs overtime." Click, the Elm Shadow contract diagram. This theft was carried out under a deniable asset contract assigned to a subcontractor, Emblem Facilities, allowing Elliston Meridian to benefit from the cost savings while being shielded from direct liability. I moved through the slides with a cold, relentless precision. The press machine schedules, the maintenance logs showing the removal of safety guards. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gesture wildly. I simply presented the evidence, piece by damning piece, letting the facts build on each other like the stones of a prison wall. Every number I presented from Marlowe's USB drives matched the numbers from the anonymous email. Every inconsistency he had described was now a data point in a chart. It was a perfect, self-contained loop of corruption, and I was showing them every single link in the chain. It was Kira Holt who broke first. "This is absurd," she snapped, her voice sharp with indignation. "This is unverified, unsubstantiated data. Where did you even get this, Ms. Vale? From some disgruntled ex-employee with an axe to grind?" I didn't look at her. I advanced to my final slide. It contained nothing but the large black and white QR code. "My sources are confidential," I said, my voice flat. "And they are protected under the Whistleblower Protection Act of 1989. This QR code links to a full evidentiary package. Every file has been cryptographically hashed and timestamped on a public ledger. The chain of custody is secure, digital, and legally irrefutable." Grant Elliston, who had been watching me with a look of bored curiosity, finally leaned forward. The predator was now paying attention. He rested his elbows on the polished table, a faint, humorless smile on his lips. "Let me be clear, Ms. Vale," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Are you attempting to blackmail this board?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Julian flinched. One of the H&F partners shifted uncomfortably in his seat. They saw the off-ramp Grant was giving them. If this was blackmail, they could dismiss me as a criminal, bury the evidence, and salvage their precious deal. I met Grant's gaze without flinching. "No, Mr. Elliston," I said. "This is a rescue." I let that statement land. Then I delivered the final blow. I turned my body slightly, addressing both sides of the table, making it clear that my ultimatum was for everyone in the room. "Here is the situation," I said, my voice resonating with a finality that left no room for negotiation. "Elliston Meridian will immediately reinstate the full back pay for every affected employee at the Rook County facility. They will commission an independent, third-party safety audit with binding recommendations, and they will restore the contract for Emblem Facilities, with full back pay for the period of their dismissal." I paused, then looked at the Huxley and Frey partners. If these conditions are not met, Huxley and Frey will walk away from this merger. The reputational damage and legal liability of knowingly acquiring a company with these practices is untenable. Then, I looked back at Grant. And if, for some reason, Huxley and Frey decides to proceed with the merger anyway, I will personally deliver this entire evidentiary package to the National Labor Relations Board and the federal inspectors at OSHA. I had trapped them, all of them. H&F couldn't proceed without accepting massive liability. Elliston couldn't refuse without the deal collapsing and a federal investigation being triggered. The effect in the room was instantaneous. It was as if someone had sucked all the air out. The low hum of the building's ventilation system suddenly seemed deafeningly loud. I saw a senior partner from H&F slowly, deliberately, put down his pen. Julian Mott's face was the color of ash. Mason was staring at me, his mouth slightly agape, a look of utter, uncomprehending shock on his face. He was finally seeing me, truly seeing me, for the first time. But the most telling detail was Carol, the secretary. She had been taking minutes throughout the entire meeting, her pen flying across her steno pad in a neat, practiced shorthand. As my final words landed in the silent room, I saw her hand, the one that had been moving for 40 years, simply stop, her pen hovering, motionless, in the middle of a sentence. The official record had ceased. The truth had just taken over. Just as the last syllable of my ultimatum faded, a soft, electronic click echoed from the far end of the room. The grand mahogany doors swung silently inward, framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright lights of the outer hallway, stood a man. He was old, but he stood with a ramrod-straight posture that spoke of a discipline long ingrained. He wore a simple, clean dark jacket, the one I had left for him with the doorman. At his side, poised and alert, sat Echo. A new, handsome leather collar was fastened around his neck, the metal tag gleaming. It was Marlowe Pike. A wave of shock rippled through the room. This was an intrusion of the highest order, a breach of their sacred, sterile space. Grant Elliston recovered first, his face a mask of thunderous rage. "Who in the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice a low boom. "Security, get this man out of here." Before anyone could move, Carol, the secretary, spoke from her place at the table, her voice calm and unruffled. "He is an invited guest, Mr. Elliston." She looked down at her notes. "Mr. Marlowe Pike, attending as a community guest of Miss Vale, as per Huxley and Frey Bylaw 217. Julian Mott looked as if he was going to swallow his own tongue. Grant was momentarily speechless, outmaneuvered by a piece of corporate policy he had never known existed. Marlowe walked slowly, deliberately into the room. He didn't look at the powerful men in their expensive suits. He walked directly to the head of the table where I stood. Echo padded silently beside him, his gaze sweeping the room. A quiet, watchful guardian. Marlowe reached into his jacket pocket and placed 2 items on the polished mahogany surface. The first was his old, scratched aluminum emblem facilities ID tag. The second was a single sheet of paper. "This is a sworn, notarized statement from my former shift supervisor, confirming my employment, the removal of the safety guards on the cutting machines, and the complaint my team filed regarding overtime discrepancies," Marlowe said, his voice raspy but steady. He looked at me. "Your lawyer, Mr. Colton, is very efficient." I gave a small nod. Then I picked up my phone. "As I was saying," I continued, my voice cutting through the stunned silence, "this is about a pattern of behavior." I tapped the screen. The room's high-fidelity speakers hissed to life. It was the audio from my morning meeting. "First," Grant's voice, dripping with dismissive contempt, "then you'll never lead a merger. You don't have the Constitution for it." Then, Kira Holt's voice, smooth and conspiratorial. "Maybe it's just a matter of language. Instead of mandatory, we could use guidelines. It would give us the flexibility we need." The recording was crystal clear. It was the sound of them dismissing my ethics and actively planning to circumvent them, captured in their own arrogant voices. I saw Julian sink lower in his chair, his face pale. I saw Kira's carefully constructed composure crack, a flicker of pure, animal panic in her eyes. "That recording is inadmissible," she sputtered, finding her voice. It's out of context. It is a legal recording of a business meeting, and its context is sitting right in front of you, I said, gesturing to Marlowe. But perhaps you're right. Perhaps we need more context. I tapped my remote again. The slide of the QR code vanished, replaced by a video. The quality was grainy, time-stamped in the top corner, 02:17 a.m. It was the view from the dashboard of a Caldera police cruiser. It was parked across the street from the Rook County facility, the chain-link fence and the stark, windowless wall of the warehouse filling the frame. After my meeting with Mr. Pike, I was able to request this through an expedited Freedom of Information Act filing, citing a pattern of industrial noise complaints and emergency services calls to that specific address, I explained calmly. For a moment, nothing happened on screen. Then, the silence was shattered by a sound, a high-pitched, metallic scream, the sound of a machine being pushed far beyond its tolerance. The main cargo doors of the warehouse suddenly burst open, and figures, workers, came running out into the loading bay, their movements frantic, silhouetted against the harsh industrial lights. They were scattering, some pointing back inside, their body language a universal semaphore of fear and chaos. Kira Holt went white as a sheet. This wasn't an anonymous data point. This was visceral, visual proof of the terror her flexible language had created in the dead of night. Beside her, Mason, who had been frozen this whole time, finally broke. "Nova, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Stop. Just stop." I looked at him, at the man who had drafted my professional termination notice less than an hour ago, and I gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of my head. No, I would not stop. Grant Elliston had seen enough. His empire was being dismantled in front of his eyes, and his instinct was to flee the battlefield. He pushed his chair back violently, the heavy wood scraping against the floor. He was about to stand, to walk out, to use his physical departure as a final, desperate assertion of his power. "Sit down, Mr. Elliston." The voice was quiet, but it carried the absolute, unquestioned authority of the man who owned the room. It was Arthur Vance, the chairman of the board of Huxley and Frey, a man in his late 70s. Vance rarely spoke at these meetings, preferring to observe, but now, his pale blue eyes were fixed on Grant, and they were as hard and unforgiving as chips of ice. Grant froze, halfway out of his chair. He looked at Vance, then at the other H&F partners, who were all staring at him, their expressions a mixture of fear and newfound resolve. He slowly, stiffly, sank back into his seat. He had lost control of the room. He had lost control of the deal. He had lost... I walked to his end of the table and placed a single, bound document in front of him. It was a one-page settlement agreement, drafted by Reese. "Here are the terms," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "Full restoration of back pay for all affected employees, effective immediately, a $1 million fund, administered by an independent third party, for safety upgrades and maintenance at the Rook County facility. And you will sign a 90-day agreement to allow an independent oversight committee, which I will lead, full and unrestricted access to all your labor and payroll data." I paused, letting the weight of the terms sink in. "You will sign this tonight. If you do not, this deal is terminated, and tomorrow morning, a federal courier will be delivering my full evidentiary package to the Department of Labor." As I spoke, a series of soft chimes echoed around the table as every laptop and phone received a new email. I glanced at my own screen. It was from Reese Colton. Subject: For immediate review, Elliston Meridian Labor Practices Evidentiary File. The email contained a link to the secure, time-stamped, and publicly hashed data vault. It contained a list of every affected employee, and it contained a list of 3 other Elliston facilities where his preliminary analysis suggested similar discrepancies were taking place. It was a digital coup de grace. The evidence was no longer just in my possession. It was now in theirs. It was their problem, their liability, their ticking bomb. In the span of a few heartbeats, the world had been remade. The entire axis of power in that room had violently, irrevocably shifted. It no longer emanated from the cold, heavy gold of Grant Elliston's Rolex, a symbol of time bought and sold. It now radiated from the other end of the table, from a piece of paper, a worn-out ID tag, and the quiet dignity of a man whose hand, now healing beneath a clean white bandage, had borne the true cost of their ambition. There was no negotiation. There was only the dead, heavy silence of a king who had been checkmated in his own throne room. Grant Elliston stared at the single-page agreement on the polished table in front of him, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. Every line of the document was an iron bar in the cage he now found himself in. He looked from the paper to the unblinking eyes of Arthur Vance, the H&F chairman, searching for an escape route, a sign of weakness. He found none. He looked at me, and in my gaze, he saw not a subordinate to be crushed, but a reflection of his own ruin. With a final, shuddering breath of resignation, he picked up the heavy, gold-plated fountain pen that sat on his desk blotter. The silence in the room was so absolute that the small click of the cap being removed sounded like a gunshot. He pressed the nib to the paper, and the scratch of it against the fiber was the only sound in the world. Each stroke of his signature was heavy, deliberate, and filled with a loathing that was almost palpable. It was not the confident flourish of a titan signing a deal. It was the labored scrawl of a man signing his own confession, his own surrender. When he finished, he shoved the paper away from him as if it were a venomous snake and threw the pen down onto the table with a sharp clatter. Beside him, Mason moved as if in a trance. He didn't look at his father. He didn't look at me. He simply stared into the middle distance, his face a blank canvas of shock and disillusionment. He slowly reached up and unclipped the small, discreet microphone from his tie, placing it gently on the table as if it were a sacred object he was no longer worthy of touching. Then, he stood, pushed his chair in with a quiet, final scrape, and walked out of the room without a single word, without a single glance back. The grand mahogany doors swung shut behind him, sealing off not just a business deal, but a future that had now ceased to exist. Grant followed a moment later, his delegation scrambling in his wake like courtiers fleeing a fallen king. The room, suddenly half empty, felt vast and quiet. It was Arthur Vance who finally spoke, his quiet voice filling the void. He looked down the long table at me, his expression unreadable, but for a flicker of something that might have been respect in his ancient eyes. "Ms. Vale," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "You will, of course, be retaining your position as lead on this project." He paused, then gave a slight nod. "And the recommendations in Project Oriole, they will no longer be recommendations. They will be mandatory, for this merger, and for all future H&F engagements. You have set a new standard for this firm tonight." I simply nodded, the words of thanks catching in my throat. The victory felt less like an exhilarating triumph, and more like the quiet, weary end of a long and bloody war. My gaze fell upon Marlowe, who had stood silently by my side through it all. I walked to him, my professional composure finally cracking, and knelt down. I buried my face in Echo's thick, warm fur, and the dog, sensing the shift, leaned into me, giving a soft whine and licking my hand. I felt a hand on my shoulder, and looked up to see Marlowe looking down at me, his clouded eyes clear with a profound and simple gratitude. He squeezed my shoulder gently. 17 minutes, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. 17 minutes well spent. And in those 4 words, the entire chaotic, brutal, and transformative ordeal of the last 36 hours was given its true name. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about a merger or a promotion or a broken engagement. It was about the value of a small sliver of time, the choice to stop, to see, to act. It was about 17 minutes of humanity in a world that ran on a colder, more ruthless clock. I stood up and walked to the vast glass wall that overlooked the city. The rain had stopped. The storm had passed. Below, the city of Caldera glittered, its billion lights reflecting off the wet streets, looking sharp and clear, as if the entire metropolis had just been wiped clean. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was an automated email from the newly created oversight system. The subject line was simple: acknowledged. Independent oversight protocol activated. A link inside led to a secure portal, where the first of Elliston's data streams were already beginning to populate. The machine was now in motion. I walked back to my place at the table. I closed my laptop. The soft click of the latch, an echo of the pen cap from moments before. I picked up the presentation remote and pressed the power button. The screen at the end of the room went black. The boardroom, now dark and quiet, felt different, less like a tomb and more like a space that could finally breathe again. There was no round of applause. There were no triumphant speeches. No one shook my hand or clapped me on the back. The moment was too raw, too heavy for such simple celebrations. All that remained was the quiet, profound truth of what had happened. A clock that had once been used for judgment was now simply a measure of time, time that had been rightly given back to the people who had earned it. I walked out of the boardroom and down the long, silent glass hallway. At the main reception desk, I stopped. The young woman, Chloe, looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She had undoubtedly heard the raised voices, seen the exodus. I gave her a small, tired smile. I took a plain white envelope and a pen from the desk. I didn't write a note. There was nothing left to say. I simply dropped the heavy diamond ring inside, sealed the flap, and wrote a single name on the front: Mason. I pushed it across the marble counter to her. "Could you please make sure he gets this?" I asked. Then I added, as a final act of closure, "There's no return needed." I turned and walked toward the elevators, leaving the ring, the firm, and the life I had almost lived behind me, the weight of it all finally, blessedly, gone. The end. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'm always so curious to know where my voice is traveling. So please comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from. I'd love to connect with you. So let's share our thoughts on the story in the comments. And if you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like for extra support. You can also hit the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.